Broth? Cluck? Yeah. Live well, don't compromise, eat brave. Well, yes.
Have you ever met a person who hasn't ever heard the story of Titanic? Unlikely. Even if you ask a 10-year-old, they'll tell you exactly what took down the gigantic ship. However, some survivors of the sinking legend would beg to differ. Here's one of their stories, and surprise, it has nothing to do with an iceberg. Throughout her career working at sea, Miss Violet Constance Jessup survived not one, but 3 shipwrecks, the Titanic included. She started out as a stewardess on board the Olympic, which crashed in 1911. Just 7 months later, she survived the Titanic, and then went on to serve as a nurse for the British Red Cross on the HMHS Britannic. This ship sank from an explosion, but Violet yet again came out of it and kept working at sea. This adventurous spirit finally settled down in Great Ashfield, England. Just like Margaret Brown, Violet was often jokingly called Miss Unsinkable. There's definitely truth to that. The unsinkable Molly Brown is one of the most popular and liked characters in the 1964 movie and earlier Broadway musical, based on the great ship's unlucky maiden voyage. But this woman wasn't just thought up by some Hollywood screenwriter. She was a real passenger. Margaret Brown was known even before the Titanic for being one of the first women in the U.S. to run for office, 8 years before women could even vote. She was in London when she found out that her grandson was sick, so she headed to New York immediately. Because this decision was so last minute, very few people knew that she was on board the Titanic. Once the ship struck the iceberg, Mrs. Brown selflessly helped other passengers into the lifeboats until she was eventually talked into getting into one herself. After being rescued by the RMS Carpathia, she organized a committee with other first-class survivors and Carpathia passengers. The committee would raise money and provide counseling for the more destitute people that lived through the tragedy. Upon arriving in New York, she wouldn't leave the rescue ship until she made sure that every survivor received medical attention and found their families. Mrs. Brown was given a medal for her goodwill in helping the Titanic survivors. She was also later awarded the French Legion of Honor for her charitable work rebuilding France and helping soldiers. A truly extraordinary woman. The actress Dorothy Gibson, most famous for her role in the 1912 movie Saved from the Titanic, was actually one of the survivors of the catastrophe. She and her mother were coming back to the U.S. on board the Titanic after vacationing in Europe. The two had been playing bridge with some friends when the ship struck the iceberg. They escaped together in the half-empty lifeboat number 7, but nearly sank again when one of the other survivors noticed a hole in the boat. Luckily, they were able to plug it up with some clothes. Lifeboat. But if you're hoping for a happy end at this point, I'll have to disappoint you. The boat was so overcrowded, they pushed the young man with a paddle when he tried to stick to the boat. He begged for help, but they refused to show mercy. Their logic was simple. One extra man in that boat could have made it sink, and no one in it would have had a chance for survival. He had to let go of the boat, and what happened after is a miracle. Vodkanak woke up alive on board another ship. That ship was the Carpathia, and it was en route to New York with lucky survivors on board. The writer had a terrible headache, and he saw double. But what mattered most is that he escaped from the freezing ocean. How did he do it? He couldn't remember anything. The next evening, the ship made it to New York. Without his passport and money, which he must have lost at some point during the rescue, Vodkanak was taken to the hospital. 12 days later, a woman came into the room, and all she could say through tears was, "Oh, my dear boy." She turned out to be the person who saved Vodkanak. Mrs. Astor was in her 50s, and she told the young man the lifeboat he tried to get into didn't actually leave without him. Mrs. Astor told the sailors that the young man was her son, and she wouldn't let them go without him, since she'd already lost her husband on the Titanic. It turned out she kept Vodkanot's passport and money, and invited him to visit her when he felt better. After he recovered, the writer was reunited with his family in Boston. Vodkanot lived a long and happy life, and as a great storyteller, he shared what happened to him many times. Interestingly, he's never mentioned an iceberg hitting the Titanic, and always spoke about an explosion. If what he said was true, something must have caused that huge explosion. Professional tennis player Richard Norris Williams was on board the Titanic with his father. Given that the lifeboats, as many know, were reserved for women and children, these two guys were left to fend for themselves on a sinking ship. They did pretty well at first, but once the ship had sunk deep enough to leave the remaining passengers floating in the water, a huge smokestack suddenly collapsed and crashed down on the surface of the water. Perhaps it was purely coincidental, or maybe something more, but the resulting wave washed Richard toward collapsible lifeboat A, so he climbed in. Unfortunately, that lifeboat was full of freezing water that passengers had to stand in up to their knees. These survivors were later transferred to lifeboat number 14, but the damage of the cold water had already been done. Williams got frostbite on his legs, and once on board the Carpathia, the doctors recommended amputating both his lower limbs. But the tennis star would have none of it, so he exercised every day and his legs slowly recovered. He even continued his tennis career, became an Olympic gold medalist, and served in the Army. He later became a successful investment banker and president of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Now, it's your turn. There's a widespread misconception that if you jump a moment before the elevator hits the bottom, you will somehow decrease the impact on your body. Firstly, how are you planning to understand when you should jump? You can't see through metal, can you? Secondly,